Hey, welcome to Hear God's Word. This is Michael Loinger. In this podcast, we study and dissect the Bible to better understand what it means and is trying to say. We'll cover theology and dig into the original meaning through language and word studies. We'll even discuss scientific and historical ties, but we'll always come back to the basics. There's so many layers to the Bible, and it's all important. So, if you want to hear what God has to say, then let's dive in. All right, so we're finally finishing the story of Lot as pertains to everything here in Genesis. And if we go through the roller coaster ride of his life, we know that he settled in Sodom and that it looked like the grass was greener there, but sometimes just because the resources are better somewhere doesn't mean that it's actually good. God cares more about righteousness than human progress, because the way we see progress so many times is not how God sees it. And we may think we know better, but just look at the story of Babel, like we talked about. We also finished talking about the destruction and how he had escaped to this city called Zoar. And we also saw at the very end of the chapter how Abraham, his uncle, was out looking towards the plains and saw smoke rising from Sodom. And it ends in the really beautiful way where it says that God had honored Abraham's request. He removed Lot from the middle of the destruction and the cities that Lot had lived in. And so, as we talked about, he made it just outside of the perimeter of the destruction. And we're going to end up picking up with the story when he's in Zoar after the destruction was over. But we also take a look at how amazing it is that God saved him, that all these other places around that he was living in, the grass wasn't greener there. We just saw that even if they did have more innovation than all the cities around, even if their city was more built up and secure, more resources, more lavish resources, it wasn't worth making the trade because now it's gone. And Lot has lost his wife. He's lost a lot of his friendship. And now he's in this little city. And one last thing that we observe to a pillar of salt, raining down, turned to ash, with the ash that was falling from the sky in and of itself. We see that it's interesting how everything always comes back to Genesis 3. God gave some instructions, they weren't listened to, and then death came. We see the very same thing for Lot's wife. And now here Lot is with just his two daughters, and they're on their own. And so we get to verse 30 in chapter 19. It says, Lot went up from Zoar with his two daughters and settled in the mountains because he was afraid to live in Zoar. So he lived in a cave with his two daughters. Later, the older daughter said to the younger, "Our dad's getting old, and there's no man in this country to sleep with us the way everyone does. Come, let's make our father drunk with wine so we can go to bed with him and preserve our family line through our father." So that night they made their father drunk with wine and the older daughter came in and went to bed with her father, but he wasn't aware of when she laid down with him or when she got up. So in the morning, the older daughter said to the younger, "Since I went to bed with my father last night, let's make him drunk again tonight. Then you go in and go to bed with him so that we can preserve our family line through our father." So they made their father drunk that night as well, and the younger one came and went to bed with him. But he was not aware of when she lay down with him and when she got up. In this way, both of Lot's daughters became pregnant by their father. The older daughter gave birth to a son and named him Moab. He's the ancestor of the Moabites today. The younger daughter also gave birth to a son and named him Ben-Ami. He is the ancestors of the Ammonites today. Let's just take a pause, and we just had such a story of righteousness and faith, and Lot standing up and doing what God asked him, even though there were a little bit of compromises made. At least he worked with God and he did get out of there, and God preserves him only for a very similar story to what we found, if you remember, back in the story of Noah. The man gets drunk and bad things come to follow. However, the story is kind of interesting, as we'll talk about, because in no way, again, like we talked about, it doesn't spend time disciplining or saying how these acts were wrong. But I think that it's very clear by the story that this is not ideal. This is not how God wanted things to go down for them. However, he knew that this is the way things were going to be. And just one thing before we get into the topic of the daughters a little bit later, and them essentially going to bed with their dad, is it was vital and important. And if you look at how many times it talked about them being concerned about preserving the family line, that's everything that you have to live for. You know, your job in this generation is to keep passing down life. And that's why God allowed men to have seeds and to plant them and to create the next generation. And that's why God made women able to have children and to give birth to the next generation. And this is actually the very first of the instructions and commands that God gave. You know, he said, be fruitful and multiply. You know, just as fruit comes from a seed, and then essentially it carries the seed for the next generation. In the same way, that's essentially what the Bible is talking about. It's talking about how it is important for us to pass something good into the next generation. And obviously, the biggest part of passing something good to the next generation is creating one to begin with. Otherwise, you can't pass anything down to them if you don't create them in the first place. And to lose your family line is a shame. And of course, it seems kind of like Lot had maybe given up hope here. And let's break down and get into more of the details, and we'll talk more about the ethicalness of all that was going on there, as well as the genealogy related aspects. But let's hone in and focus on the fact they were living in Zoar. And it says that they were actually there. Lot was there with his 2 daughters, but immediately it says, we're not sure how long he lived there, but it says he went up out of Zoar. And so that direction, it's both literal and a figure of speech. To go up out of a place means to leave. But ironically, he went up to live in the mountains, and specifically, him and his daughters went up in the mountains to live in a cave. And so they made their home in a cave, and a lot of people did that back in the ancient days. They used cliff areas as places to build shelters and dwellings, and you see a lot of ancient civilizations built their homes into the caves built into mountainsides and things of this sort. And you see that's happening, but obviously it's much more remote, and we'll see some other problems. But why did he leave Zoar? It says that he feared living there. And so why was he afraid of Zoar? He wanted to find a place that he could escape the destruction, so he went to this place, Zoar. And even though he went there to survive the destruction, there's many possibilities. There's a lot of people who think that either A, he was afraid that even though God had spared it for that moment because he okayed it, he was potentially afraid that it was also going to be destroyed, just like Sodom. And another aspect that plays into things, also, he had just come off of a traumatic experience. He could have thought, well, just as God destroyed that place. Point number 2 is Zoar probably was not a very innocent city either, because it seemed as if even though it was branched away from these other cities, it probably was still, you could say, a suburb or connection to Sodom. And I'm sure a lot of people did commerce and brought the culture of Sodom over there. And just as, a suburb of where I live out in Chicago, even though you might not live in Chicago, sometimes the activity and the culture of Chicago comes to you, whether you want that or not. And for anyone who doesn't know, Chicago is not known as a wonderful city by any means. Of course, there's great aspects of it, just like there were great aspects of Sodom, but by no means is it a good and righteous city. In one aspect, it is different because I know there are a lot of churches that are moving and doing good things over there. And so God's not going to destroy Chicago probably tomorrow. However, there's a level of evil that I'm trying to say trickles down from these big cities, and it gets even into the culture of the smaller cities. You hear news or things that are going on in the big city because, if you want something that's not available in your hometown, sometimes you got to travel out to the bigger cities. And so with that, that's one possibility, that they were also on the verge of corruption, but they had some more righteous people, yet Lot was still concerned that this place was still evil enough to the point where God was going to destroy them as well. And it was only a ticking time bomb for that place in addition. So we have these sort of arguments. Then there's also some geological ones. Some people suggest that the Dead Sea was actually rising during that time and that there were earthquakes that were going on. So, with the fear of potentially geological things that were going to affect this city, that made the place unsafe and unstable. And there's also suggestions that people just fled and left this place because they were also afraid of being overthrown and destroyed by either God or surrounding places, since they would have been an easier target now without the Sodom metroplex, you could say, at their protection. They were kind of this lone city, small, out in the middle of a place that had become desolate. And so I'm sure there was an intimidating place to stay and live. And so with the potential desertion and other factors that could have been playing in, Lot could have also realized, hey, we're not safe sticking around here. We got to get out. It said that he had fear. And so we don't know 100% of all the reasons. It could have been all that mixed in. But also we look back and remember that the angels had told him to flee and escape to the mountains. And where did Lot and his two daughters go? It says they left for the mountains. Way to go, Lot. Good job. So we could also see that maybe he was afraid that even though maybe nothing was going to happen to Zoar, maybe something was going to happen to him bad if he didn't listen to God and go there. And so it could have been a personal conviction that he knew he should go to the mountains. And it could have been a mixture of all of these reasons. Again, the fact that God was calling him there for a reason. It wasn't safe where he was. He knew that the mountains were the safest place for him to go. But as we continue talking about this story, then we see he actually does listen to God. He does move to the mountains. And so it's a good thing in one sense for their safety, but we can see that it's a different problem because now here he is isolated in a cave with two daughters and there's no men. And granted, remember that the two daughters Lot had just lost their fiancés back in Sodom. And so that had to have been traumatic for them. They had started sewing their hearts together with these guys only to find out how they thought that God was a joke, that these prophetic warnings were a joke, and God allowed them to escape from it, but not their fiancés. That had to have been heartbreaking for them. And in one sense, we also have to remember that Lot probably had a big thing to do with the marriage of his daughters being worked out, because we know that back in that era, and even to this day, there's some tribes that still do arranged marriages, that the father in the family has a lot to do with the person that their children will end up marrying. And so most likely it wasn't a Romeo Juliet falling in love against their dad's will sort of story that they had. We can see that it seemed like it was a family cohesive decision that, hey, Lot, their father, had helped them to find or agreed upon a suitable spouse for the both of them, and they were about to get married. This was a good thing on everyone's behalf and party, but we can see obviously these men were probably not good men, even though they could have ended up being, if they continued to live there, who knows what kind of corruption they could have continued and also dragged Lot's daughters into. Since they were destroyed with everyone else, it's pretty clear that they were part of the evil that was going on there. And that's a difficult and sad reality to think about. But we see now they're in the middle of the mountains where they can't find anyone. If they were back in Zoar, maybe it would have been easier to find someone. I'm not sure if they were part of a cave settlement where there were homes built into the caves along the mountainside, or if they had found a solo cave that solely only they knew about, or only a few friends that they maybe found in the area. However, we can see they were pretty isolated because it says that there weren't any men for his daughters. And in one sense, like I talked about, Lot, their dad, has a part to play in this because in one sense, he should be helping, not doing 100% of the work, but at least contributing to help and find a suitable partner for each of his daughters. And it seems like Lot had maybe given up hope because he was getting old, and it seems pretty clear like he was probably depressed and discouraged and had just decided, screw it, we're gonna just live out in these caves and stay out here until we die. And so many times when things don't go our way, we get into what I call the sore loser syndrome. And this is a big struggle that I have in my own personal life. Whenever something isn't going well, I just want to retreat, be alone, and just let things happen and just have a apathetic and nonchalant attitude about things, even when it hurts myself and the people around me or me making any progress in life. Obviously, that's not what God wants for me. That's not what God wanted for Lot either. He wanted him to make a new life for himself out in the mountains and maybe expand and move on now that he's found some safety. And also, we have to consider, couldn't he have potentially moved back, especially since he didn't have all of these possessions anymore? He originally moved away because him and all of his herdsmen and the people that were part of his family, or the branch of his family, they were arguing over the land because there wasn't enough for them. But we can see Abraham still has all of that, and it's probably expanding and still growing even more. And if Lot still had all of that in Sodom, seems as if probably none or barely any of them, if any, actually left with him. They all died there. All of his possessions, all of his people, all of the house of Lot that was being built, all gone. The only thing that's left in their family is his 2 daughters, and he doesn't even have any sons to carry on, and so that was probably deflating for him, because your sons are who pass on the family tribe, the house, the tradition, yet he still had his 2 daughters. His lineage could still be at least passed down through them, but it seems he lost motivation to try and help his daughters find good husbands. And so basically his daughters felt screwed and abandoned by their dad. It seems pretty clear, because they got so desperate that they started talking about the fact and possibility that they would have to sleep with their dad if they were ever going to have kids and carry on the family line. And so that's exactly what happens. They make this plan to get their dad drunk. Then each of them take a night with their dad, and who knows if they did it once or multiple times, just to make sure that the deal was solidified. And we won't get into any more details about this. We could go into what were they thinking. Like I said, part of what we can say is we know that they knew they had an obligation to carry on their family line to the next generation. And here we can see that despite their dad, who had fallen off the map, and even though he was a righteous man before, he basically let himself fall pretty hard. And remember this story, because we're going to see similar stuff in the future. And I just want to remind you guys that if you came to the Bible thinking that it's filled with a bunch of stories of encouragement and hope, you're right. But you're also sadly mistaken at the very same time, because are stories like this ones that are filled with goody two-shoe activity? Absolutely not. Literally, this is a story about incest and the fact that God didn't even discipline the 2 daughters for doing this, because they were acting out of desperation. Who knows how old they were at this time, whether they were in their teens, their 20s, their 30s, or whether they're getting 40, 50 years old, and it's really weird them doing it with their dad. But it's clear that they had not completely lost hope of looking towards the next generation, having some hope in them. And even though they did something really sad, disgraceful, I'm sure it was talked about by people surrounding them. But also you have to remember that they're kind of isolated out here anyways, so there's no one to ask them, hey, who did you get pregnant with? Who's your husband? Well, you see, our both of us, our dad. Did anyone associate with them during this time, or were they completely isolated, and especially during the time of the pregnancy? And what did Lot think when they got pregnant? It doesn't even say. And like I was saying, a story that's reminiscent of this is Noah. Noah was such a righteous man. We learned so many great things about him. And then it's just like the end of his life. The last many years were just sad and tragic. Like he fell off the map. Like even Noah did, it seems. Like he was such a great man of God, and he still will be remembered as a man of faith. However, he just let the end of his story become really sad and tragic. And so this actually stirs up something that I haven't even spent much time thinking about, and that's the fact that even though there are good times in life, there's obviously a lot of drama that can come even into the lives of people who are on the right track in life. And just because someone is a person of faith and doing well doesn't mean you shouldn't expect, unfortunately, and account for and have grace for the fact that there's going to be some really questionable and sad and even disturbing, disgusting, weird stories that happen in your life. God knows and understands all of these things, and he can still work with anyone. And was God okay with Lot's two daughters doing this? It doesn't say. He probably wasn't happy and cheering it all on, but he knew the desperateness of the situation, and he let it be as it was. And we also go to the end of the story, and we see that from verse 37 through 38, it talks about in 37 that the older daughter gave birth to a son called Moab, and he became the ancestor of the Moabites. Remember these people because that's important. Another interesting thing about the name Moab, which again is a little bit weird and cringy, you could say, but it literally means from my dad or from father. And so we know that the son came from her father, that the older daughter, her partner was her dad. And so did Lot have a say in his older daughter naming her son essentially after him as her dad? As obviously this whole story is just something else. After God did so much to rescue them, this is the best that can come out of it. It can be so difficult to see the good in the story, but we see that, especially if you look at stories that are to come, we see that the Moabites actually come into play as one of the peoples, one of the tribes, groups, and nations that end up encountering the Israelites, which is Abraham's people, in the future. And to further that, we have the younger daughter who gives birth, and she names the son, which Ben means son, and then Ami is the word for my people. And so basically, if you put it all together, it's the son of my people. And her people, the younger daughter, they were the Ammonites. And you can see the resemblance, Ammonites, and a lot of times the ending letters would change. And instead of Ami, it would be Ammon, and then instead of ites, you'd have Im or E at the end, so that Ami basically becomes the Ammonites. And so now we have two more nations that are cataloged. We have a bunch of nations of Canaanites in this area. We have Amorites, which are one of those Canaanite peoples. And now we have also Ishmael, and they end up becoming the Arabians and those in the further southern areas of those kingdoms down there. And now we also have to the east of the Dead Sea, two groups that are just beginning to spring up, some new countries or people groups or tribes that are going to turn into nations. And that is the Moabites and the Ammonites. Again, they're going to be important to remember. So even though God didn't necessarily maybe want this to happen, at the same time, maybe he did. I don't know all of God's will, because at least from what it seems is it doesn't really say when God approves or doesn't approve of things exactly, if that is what he wanted to happen, because I think we could say that God didn't want Adam and Eve to fall into sinning and taking from the fruit from the tree and disobeying him. I think that that's clear. I think it's clear that he didn't want Cain to kill his brother. I think it's clear that he didn't want to have to destroy Sodom. But when we do things as people, when God lets us have the free reign, he works with us. And it's at least from looking at scripture and seeing how God feels and expresses himself through the story, to me, it seems like the scripture is pointing to the fact that God already knows everything. He knows what's going to happen. He can see stuff ahead of time of it happening, but he allows people to do their thing, make their choices, and he's trying to work with people in the process and keep them from making bad decisions so that they can choose to be and do what's right. But many people don't end up listening to God, and that's where the big downfall in all of these stories have been coming from. People who have not taken their interactions with God seriously. And so that brings us to wrapping things up with the story of Lot. Going back to talking about him moving out of Zoar, we know that God cares about, and he wanted Lot to go on to be a righteous man, just like he had just proven himself to be. And yet, at the same time, it's clear that he'd allowed some of the corruption that had already been infiltrating him throughout his time. Everything from his own desire to have good things when he was with Abraham, choosing the good land, which is totally fair. You know, he had the right to do that. So going off and choosing the better land over his uncle, you know, he had that desire for good things. And when that's stripped and robbed, and when he had so much good going on in Sodom, despite all of the corruption that had been bombarding him probably on a daily basis, he had allowed that to begin to decay and eat at him. And then when he'd lost everything and he was out in the mountains, we can see that it seems like he began to lose hope of anything good coming in the future for him or his daughters. And he allowed, as a not so good parent, his girls to end up suffering. He didn't take any motivation. He didn't go out and try to help find them suitable husbands. He isolated himself and his family, and it led to his daughters doing something pretty nasty with him, and he had to live with the consequences, knowing that in one sense he kind of did it to himself. He's the dad. He's supposed to have responsibility of his daughters. It probably wasn't safe for them to go out and to try and find their own husbands in the mountains. It wasn't the same as things are nowadays, and it could have been dangerous for them to travel the mountains alone. Their dad should have been out there with them, trying to help them. And so it's just a sad and desperate way that this ends. But we can see that the Bible is also big on genealogies. Like, it's all about family. It's all about countries being formed. And we see how important people groups are, because from people groups end up coming larger groups, which end up eventually sometimes turning into nations, which we can see here. God takes a bad situation, takes essentially incest children, and turns them into the fathers of would end up becoming pretty decent nations in the future. And decent not meaning good, but they end up becoming semi-great in their own respect. They end up gaining some status and resources, and they end up becoming a pretty self-sufficient nation. So some very last lessons that we can take is when God shows us love and mercy and saves us, it's for a reason, not so that we can just take advantage of it and be like, all right, thanks God for saving me. You know, now I'm just gonna be a spiritual bum the rest of my life since I'm all good, I'm saved. You know, I don't really have to do anything else, and there's nothing really to live for. Can't become complacent like Lot. However, there's also another lesson we learn, which is life is hard. Things end up happening. We can lose it all at a moment's notice, and we can become depressed. We can do pretty stupid stuff. And just like we learned about quite a while back, that in the book of Peter, 2 Peter 2, it talks about how Lot was still considered a righteous man because of him standing his ground in Sodom. And so don't let it get you down or feel like everything is completely ruined and you don't have any hope. Even if you've lost hope and you're living in that, God can still make you great one day in his kingdom if you don't entirely give up. And we don't know what happened to Lot after he had kids with his daughters. Maybe it opened his eyes and he woke up and he made the best of the situation afterwards and realized how much God wanted to work through and bless and keep him going, but he had allowed himself to get to such a bad place himself. And the fact that, he also was willing to get drunk and do wrong, even though unfortunately drunkenness was probably a big thing in Sodom, and he might have been participating quite a bit with it when he was living in Sodom. It's clear that this isn't something that God wants for anyone, and the story is in and of itself a proof that God doesn't like drunkenness, he doesn't like incest, but he'll still accomplish all the things of the future, whether or not we line up and do things well. And sometimes we end up actually creating in our mind, a branch off in the story. And, did the Ammonites and the Moabites need to be created? If anything, they seem to become an obstacle in the future to the Israelites. And so could all of that have been avoided if Lot would have married them off to better people and been in a good place and been able to raise his son and grandson? That's crazy to think about, that he made himself a grandpa twice in one, for the matter of 2 days. That's a strange thought. But moving on, he could have at least raised his sons/grandsons to be godly people and follow Yahweh, the God who had saved them. But instead, we know that the Moabites and the Ammonites aren't following God in the future. So Lot could have taught them. The daughters of Lot could have taught their children about El Shaddai, which was the name for Yahweh that they had. But also, they probably still referred to him as El Elyon because God had specifically told Abraham to call him El Shaddai. And Abraham and Lot probably hadn't seen each other much, or if at all, recently, since God had revealed that to him. So to Lot, El Elyon, the God Supreme, Almighty, had ended up saving him. And we know that basically almost every nation got the concept of who God is distorted. And we know that all of the surrounding nations around Israel were making idols and pretending like God was something different than he was. And that's a story to continue on some other time. But in summation, we see all of these things play into the story of Lot. He was a righteous man. He had some messed up things about him. But at the end of the day, even though there were all these really whacked up stories in his life, especially this one right after God had saved him, and it seems as if it had been quite some time, because it says that him and his daughters were getting older, so they probably lived in the mountains for quite a while. But we learn that God can flip the script even of dirty and nasty stories like we encounter here, and that God can still save and make use of someone's life And I'm sure that there's things that you're really not proud of with your story. But sometimes when we're just trying to get by, God still sees, understands, and allows those things, and He can still work with you, and He'll still continue shaping your future and the people around you if you're willing to work with God. And so we don't know how the story of Lot ends, but we do have to take the good of his story, stand ground against evil, but also be careful not to fall into isolation like he did in those mountains, allowing things like drunkenness just to escape probably the pain of every day and just a distraction from life to happen to us. Because when we're not in our right frame of mind, anything messed up can happen. There's one other thing that I wanted to talk about, which is the progression of sin. You had originally the fact of them moving to the city of Sodom, which, they may or may not have known the extent of the troubledness of the city when they first moved there. And it was Lot's decision. But this leads to even more sin with things like the whole city coming against them, or the fiancés that were staying in Sodom, and him having daughters that he was giving his daughters an engagement to that ended up staying in the city. And so there we see sin had another effect. And then we see there was obviously the destruction of the city. We see also a potential compromise with him going to the mountains right away instead of Zoar. But then we also see this not really elaborated, but kind of sin of isolation and allowing himself to give up that wasn't said word for word, but we can kind of see through the way that the story plays out. So that fact of essentially apathy and carelessness, this sort of sin leads to his daughter's sin and them sleeping and having incest with their father and having kids with their father. This is all a really sad, tragic progression that had slowly accumulated. What if they would have worked out things with Abraham and they would have, stayed not too far away instead of going to this area that looked like it was so green, only to find out that spiritually it was a desert. And we find out that literally nowadays, the place that they lived in became nothing but a desolate desert that has never had any inhabitants ever since it was destroyed. Isn't that insane? The effects and consequences of sin we see always end up leading to death. And thanks to God, Lot wasn't completely destroyed, but he got to at least continue his story, at least in some sort of positive way at the end of the day when you add everything up. I hope you can also hear the other side of things, to where the fact that Peter thought it was worth calling Lot still a righteous man speaks volumes, and how God flips the script when you're willing to base a chunk of your life dedicated to doing what's right, to standing ground. God can still create something beautiful and eternally good out of your story. So don't give up and allow God to work this kind of story in you, even if you're not an Abraham. Many of us are Lots, and we're just kind of side characters, and we feel like our story is the most important thing. The story breaks off, even though, we might not be the most spiritual person on the planet. God is still working a story in us, and no one should ever count that out. However, make sure that you are standing up and at least attempting to do what's right. And even if you have to fight things out with God, do that, because it's better than totally not listening to him, not believing him, and then being destroyed. So this is the main message that we can take away from the life of Lot. Hey, I'm so glad you guys could join for today's podcast. I hope things clicked for you and that you're able to better understand God's word. Jesus said, "Whoever has ears to hear, let them hear." So keep on listening to what God has to say, and I'll see you guys next time. God bless.